Oh, hi, Deborah. I am going to, hang on, I gotta pull up my PowerPoint. I'm gonna get going. We got a nice little intimate group going, so thanks everybody for coming. It's like mostly my family. Hi. Okay. So cool. Can you all see the old slideshow? I gotta put it on. Y'all see my screen? Yeah. Okay, cool. So thank you for that introduction, Megan. And yeah, thanks for hosting me at houseguest. It's been awesome to be a guest in your house. And yeah, thanks for all the help along the way. And yeah, it's been a joy to kind of show in that space. I feel like the domestic space kind of setting has been really helpful for this work that I'm showing. So I'm going to get started. I'm mostly going to show documentation from the show. And I have a couple other photos kind of interspersed in there of some older work and some references that I just want to share along the way. So I'm just going to get started here. We're going to kind of go, it's just sort of like a single room gallery space if you haven't seen the show. So I'm going to kind of go around clockwise and show the pieces and talk about them a little bit. So here's a couple overall shots of the space inside. So this is on the left-hand side. There's sort of a collection of sculptures on this side with the title wall and some window space. And then on the other side of the gallery, I have a couple of digital photographs and another sort of wall sculpture there on the lower right hand. And so in the middle, there's these two kind of large double doors that kind of divide the space into two halves. And so this is just kind of how the space looks overall if you were to walk in and kind of view it from the doorway. So I'm going to go around chronologically and talk about each piece. So the first one that I want to talk about, oh, here's another view. Sorry, I forgot I had this one in here. There's another view from that sort of like central sculpture there. So I'm going to start on this side in between the two windows. I have this little piece kind of like up against the wall. So just to zoom in a little bit closer, this piece is probably like the size of a sheet of paper. It's called Home. And I guess to talk about, I have like several bodies of work that are sort of ongoing, and this is part of one that has to do with a sort of like reference to the format of like painting, like oil painting specifically with like ornate frames and, you know, like kind of like high art, fine art, elevated traditional work. And so what I like to do is kind of like mash that up with a sort of like lowbrow subject matter. And so I have like a sort of like zoomed in kind of like low quality like sexed image here going on. And so I'm like also messing with the format as well. So it's like a series that I have in the works called like faux paintings, or sometimes I call them oil paintings. Sometimes I use oils on them. So this one has oil paint on the frame, and then the image itself is ceramic and glazed, but it's sort of arbitrary. It's kind of like whatever I feel like doing or whatever is going to give the piece the kind of luminosity that I want it to. So this is that first piece, and it's sort of one in a series of faux oil paintings. This sort of like media fuck, I like to call it, of like mashup fine art format with like lowbrow erotica subject matter. And let's see, I think I have included some sets from earlier work in a similar vein. So is a piece called Slab. It's from my thesis exhibition. This piece is pretty big. It's like 40 inches long, tall, I mean. And so this one is actually oil painted. So it's like oil on slab. And I like to mess around with sort of like fine art purist formats like oil painting and like that wall orientation. I like to play around with that. And so here's a couple of minis, which I feel like are more reminiscent of the kind of size and format of that first one in Receiver. So these are just a couple cut panels that are also from my thesis show. And this one I have like a faux fur upholstered frame. So I'm using these kind of like kitschy, synthetic, cheap craft materials and kind of mashing them up with this sort of like expensive aesthetic. And so the next piece that I'm going to talk about is this central piece that's on the table here. This piece is called Daydream. It's a glazed ceramic sculpture that's kind of like being choked by tongues, multiple tongues. This is a motif that I use a lot, is the tongue. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but I have several images of different perspectives of this piece. So it's sort of sitting on this little table, and there's kind of like a faux fur pelt around the edge. I don't have a good picture of that, but it's kind of like cut in the way that you'd see like a sheepskin rug on the floor or something like that. But it's also like very clearly cheap and synthetic. So I just wanted to kind of play around with that and like reference the floor a little bit and like sit it on something that's kind of textured, so that you can kind of like feel it as you look at it a little bit. So there's these kind of like fuzzy edges that are placed around the tongues that are wrapped around the neck of this sort of like bodiless, featureless head here. So there's a couple more details I want to show around this piece. Here's like a bird's eye view, I suppose. The table is about like 35 inches, like countertop height kind of, so it's a little bit shorter than a normal pedestal would be. And so I think that the height that work is displayed is pretty important. And this is another way that I like to kind of play around with gallery structure. And so when you're standing above something like this, I think it creates this sort of like leering experience of the viewer and kind of a power dynamic, especially with the sort of gestures of the figures. So this is from above, and you can kind of see all the way down into the head and throat, uvula kind of area of this piece. So it's like entire skull is sort of like throat and tongue. And then it has no features except for this little like Cupid's bow around the lip. And yeah, let's see. I want to talk about the tongue a little bit. I use the tongue a lot as a feature in the work. I use a double-ended tongue a lot. Obviously, like I'm not so concerned with anatomical correctness. So I think that there's some sort of like humor that comes in when I am deciding to like make a big, long, double-ended tongue. It also has the sort of like line in the middle, which isn't necessarily so anatomical either. And I think it creates this sort of like long split. So like out of context, sometimes that can just read as a crease or something like that. But the tongue to me is very important. I think that I'm always sort of interested in like an orifice or this sort of like area inside that's kind of like a boundary between the inside and the outside of a body. So like in this earlier work here, I think I'm sort of like exploring that direction a little bit with these pockets that are kind of recessed, and you can go up and kind of look around in them. You can't access the backside, but there's these little like caverns in there. And so this is more figurative, but I think there's kind of like a cavern in the back of the skull here that I like to play around with. And then obviously that boundary is being violated by the tongue. I think it's sort of ambiguous whether the tongue is going in or out, and I like that kind of playing around with, you know, like what direction things are happening in. And so I think that's part of the like double-endedness of the tongues as well. And that's also sort of like a reference to a sex toy as well. So they're like clearly synthetic materials, and I'm dealing with this kind of like erotic subject matter. So that's another little kind of reference that I'm using there too. So yeah, just to talk a little bit about textures too, like it's pretty important to me to disrupt the kind of traditional exhibition space a little bit. I think I'm kind of like poking around it with the kind of like media and formats that I'm using. This piece is on like a table, which is sort of like a pedestal, but it can be kind of pushed a little bit, not like a pedestal, if I also apply like texture to the top. So this is just a detail of the tongues and how they kind of move along the faux fur and leave these like marks that are kind of like an implied motion marks, like the way that like a snake moves through the sand or something like that. I think that's kind of funny. It has like this implied thrashing that's happening on top of the table. And then here's a close-up of the side of one of the ends of the tongue tip. So there's this kind of drool coming off, have this excessively applied glaze. And I don't think this perspective shows it, but there's also like a big like slapped on pile of spit on the side of this head here as well. So yeah, just to talk maybe a little bit more about tongues. I think the tongue is like so multi-purpose. Like there's so many things that it both receives and creates. So like the tongue is kind of this like communicator, a deliverer of language. In this way, it can kind of like create worlds. It can have this really important role in world building. It's also a receiver of like taste and sensation. It's like a sex organ, I would consider it, and like one that is genderless and universal, which I think is kind of cool. And so it like fills all these different like very important sensory and communicative roles. And so I don't know, I use the tongue a lot for those reasons. And I have some images in here of, this is a screenshot from, I watch a lot of body horror and like films with practical effects in them. So this is a screenshot from one of my favorites. It's called Body Melt, just a little practical effect going on here. I like to see the side by side. I didn't do that intentionally, but I have another screenshot in here of a body horror film. So this is from Society from 1989. I just wanted to kind of mash these up next to this piece just because I think there's like something going on with, I think these two images are sort of like expulsion from the body, mouth, and throat. And then the piece I'm working with is sort of like ambiguous direction or like input or output. It's kind of unclear, but you know, I do ingest a lot of probably B-movie body horror, which I think comes through a little bit. And then this is an earlier piece. This is not in the show at houseguest either, but I just wanted to show another example of a tongue and also like an alternative display method that I'm using that's kind of evolving as I make work. There's another like small furniture piece in the show that I'll talk about a little bit later, but here's like a small like fainting couch or chase lounge work from, I think this one's from 2020. Yeah, so here's where we're at so far in the show. So behind the piece Daydream, there's these two small wall shelves with little pieces on them. And so just to zoom in a bit, I have this corner piece here that I'll talk about first. These shelves are both upholstered with this material that's sort of reminiscent of like a mattress pad or like a like linen, like bed linen materials. So this piece is in the corner. It's called Tight, and it's kind of like a little nested piece on top of this upholstered shelf. Just to zoom in a little bit, it's got this little kind of balloon, like anus form at the end here. It's kind of like real wet in there, sitting on like a sort of like ambiguous pocket crease kind of thing. And so this is just kind of like a little piece, not so conceptual. It's just kind of like a little asshole balloon. And then to move on to the other small piece, this is on the wall, kind of behind that work Daydream. And so this is like a mini tongue on a mini chase lounge. I showed you that large piece that's kind of sitting on the floor. That thing is maybe like 35 inches long. And then this little tiny shelf is, I mean, the shelf itself is maybe 14 inches, but the piece is about 7. And so, yeah, I like to play with scale a lot. I think that the scale really determines the way that you kind of look at work and look at things, and the sort of like dollhouse scale does something kind of important, like very helpless. And when you look at something that small, it's like you're sort of powerful and omniscient. And there's this, I don't know, there's this like power dynamic of the gaze that I think can be affected by altering the scale. So I like to make minis. Sometimes I made like three minis that were sort of like miniature versions of that large floor piece, like chase lounge piece that I just showed. So yeah, those are all the sculptures in the corner. I wanted to place the small tongue kind of close to the large figure with the 2 tongues wrapping around it, just to kind of play around with that tongue motif. And then, so to move to the other side of the room, here's just some details. There's little copper legs going on the bottom of the lounge. And so to move to the other side of the room, of the space, I have several photographs here on the walls, and then this like a upholstered wall hanging chase lounge on the far right. And so I wanted to create this relationship between these sort of like pieced apart body fragments. There's sort of like little snapshots of elements of the body that like maybe all together get close to a whole, but are still sort of like, I don't know, referencing this experience of like identity as being very incomplete and fragmented. So I have this one piece on the far wall. This is called Clone. It's a digital print of a photograph that is of a mirror, like a glimpse of the body, my body in the mirror. And this is just something that I sort of saw by accident. I just like walked past my bathroom door. It's like on a diagonal, and I was like, holy shit, like, is that me? And I don't know, I don't know if folks can relate to this, but I have this experience sometimes of like seeing myself, or like seeing like the image that I cast in a mirror or whatever, and just being like, oh my God, like I'm I'm really in this shit, like I'm in this body. And it's just kind of like whack to me. Like it, you know, sometimes I feel like really embodied and like present. And then other times it's like, I don't know, I've got to remind myself that I'm like actually in the flesh. And so I don't know, there's just something about this perspective to me that kind of like got at that feeling a little bit. So if we go in a little bit closer, what I like about it being like a flat image on the wall like this, I look at a lot of sort of surrealist photography, and there's sort of always these like oblique angles and sort of like confusing perspective, like what is up and what's down, kind of like Twilight Zone experience. And so when you have an image like this that's kind of illusory in the first place, and then you like move around it, like for example on this side, this is like where you would be in space, like looking directly at the mirror. So I think it's kind of interesting to take something that's already slanted and then move around it, it becomes slanted or kind of corrected when you're in a certain area. So yeah, the image is very important to me. I have been making photography for a couple of years at this point. And I think there's this relationship between kind of like illusion and photography and surrealism that I like to explore. I think the images are really a different way to communicate than sculptures. Like there's a element of trickery that I can get away with in an image that I can't necessarily with a physical object. It's just not as convincing in some ways. So here's a snapshot of the photographs in the show kind of all together. And then to move on to this little diptych set, it's called Worm. And I think they're quite a bit different than Clone, the blue piece on the wall, because they're not like trying to be confusing or mess with perspective really at all. They're just more like small cropped in snapshots of like folds and rolls on the body. So let's see if there is another image. Yeah, so they're right next to this kind of upholstered lounge on the wall. When I installed them like this, I was kind of thinking of like this whole room as like an interior, domestic interior, like a living room or a bedroom or something like that, or like split up versions of that. And so these on the wall could either be like pictures hanging in your living room, or sort of like take the place of a window or something like that, like a 2-paneled or 4-paneled window. And then there's like kind of a figure lolling around on the couch next to him. So the shape and the form of the photographs kind of like take up the space of an interior element in one way, and then they also act as sort of like case studies for the sculptures, like kind of like what I would pin up in my studio on making the sculptures or something like that. And so one thing that I did with these works, like they're framed obviously, and that's like a reference to the interior space, so then they're also matted, so there's this like 2-layer separation that kind of like, to me, like mimics like a curtain or sort of like a privacy shroud a little bit. So there's these little like glimpses of maybe like something that you shouldn't see, or like something that your neighbor accidentally sees or something like that. I think that's just kind of a way to like push the gaze back a little bit further and make it a little bit more voyeuristic. And then the last piece that I'm going to talk about in the show is called Soft Part, and it's a chase lounge that's kind of mounted on the wall here, with a little bolster pillow under its elbow. And so the ceramic figure is kind of laying in among this soft upholstered furniture, and it's kind of this like truncated form with these like chest protrusions. I think there's like some ways that it's very like surreal and abstract, and then there's some ways that like the breasts are very like representational. I think it's kind of, for me, it's like an idea of a way to like parody gender a little bit, like have those things be like a signifier, like a central component in this piece. Like it's all like lumps and mounds, and then like here's the titties. Like I don't know, I think it's just a way to point out the things that we're kind of like I'm miming about, like gender and sexuality, and stuff like that. So, and then it's laying like in among these pillows. There's a this is kind of like a bird's eye view. This piece is very low also. It's like maybe 3 feet up from the floor. And so this is another piece that you would kind of like look down upon as a viewer, and have this sort of like power dynamic over and above. And so let's see, here's a close-up. There's also like I like how the kind of heavy hardness of the figure is kind of acting upon like this soft, stretchy fabric. Like you can kind of see in the lines how it's like pulling that texture down and like making its weight apparent. And here's a close up just of like the shadow on the side of the piece. Yeah, so what else to say? I think that all the work in the show is sort of like partial little pulled apart aspects of the body. I have a quote by Judith Butler in here. It says, "Gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. In fact, it is a kind of imitation that produces the very notion of the original as an effect and a consequence of the imitation itself." So I think that what I'm trying to do when I'm fragmenting these pieces of the body, like I guess like an exercise in imitation or like replication, or just sort of like iterating like over and over and over, like the things that I see, like like in myself or around, that are kind of like located like on the shape of my body and like what that means. And so I think it's just sort of like an exercise in imitation, and there's this sort of like humor involved, like there's this playing with of the way that we kind of like view the body, in the same way sort of that like language is iterative, like it's kind of like given meaning in cycles repeatedly. I think that there's a way to do that visually, through sculpture, through image or whatever, and that's what a lot of the work is trying to do. Here is, I guess, like an overview of this part of the exhibition again. Yeah, and so that is all of the work in the show. I think the last few slides I have are honorable mentions. So these are just works that I've been looking at a lot recently. This is called My Birth by Frida Kahlo from 1932. I'm just really drawn to the imagery here. I think it's very like confrontational and also like really lovely and soft. I do kind of like watch a lot of birth videos and things like that, and I really like this painting a lot. I've been looking at it and thinking about it a lot. And there's this kind of like shroud over the face that I like. Here's a piece by Louise Bourgeois called The Reticent Child. It's part of a kind of larger little vignette exhibition piece. It's like 6 feet long, so these pieces are really small. And I just like the way that they're kind of laid out on furniture, and there's like very little detail in the figure. And there's this gesture from like such a simple and small object. It's from 2003. And then this piece is called Mouth by Gerhard Richter. And this is a painting. And so it's like painted, and then he'll use like a dry brush to kind of like move around the pigment in different ways. And it sort of creates this like blur or like obfuscation of the imagery. And it's just like a close-up of the mouth. I'm very into the holes and the liminal spaces, the orifices. So I just really like this painting a lot. So yeah, I just wanted to include a few of my favorite works right now that I've been thinking about a lot. That's all I have for the PowerPoint. I'm happy to go back and kind of talk about things in more detail. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Lalana. That was really wonderful to hear you go into detail about everything. I'll go ahead and start off the Q&A session by asking a question that I had. I was really interested in this juxtaposition that you were working within around like domestic privacy and the display of horror, and sort of like the discussion of these two tropes kind of like oscillating materially between like your use of ceramics and your use of photography. Like both of those things like they felt in conversation. Do you feel like they're in conversation? I'm trying to like pose an actual question for you. Like,
Yeah.
are they?
Oh, totally. Yeah, maybe I should have included some like previous work. I feel like one thing I noticed about the work in this show is that the photography is kind of like disconnected from the objects. When I originally started, obviously like not obviously, I don't know, my background in photography is from documentation photography. So I'm just like very stubborn and I refuse to pay photographers to photograph my work. And so I just like learned how to do it that way. And then in grad school, I started experimenting with like photographing the pieces, like the objects, the sculptures with my own body. And I don't know, there was just something that was kind of happening there, especially with the work that's sort of like, I kind of like use a palette that's really similar to my own skin. And so there's some pieces that kind of blend in and create this like a kind of like illusion space of like what things are what, like what's synthetic and what's not. That to me is like really exciting about photography, because like you don't get to look real close at the textures, or like I can fool you with Photoshop and like some digital techniques. Like you don't necessarily have access to what's going on in real space. Like you only get access to this one perspective, right? So I think that's kind of fun. Like I think that I can like trick people in ways that I can't with the sculptures, and kind of like use my body as an actual object as well, like in the photo frame. And yeah, what else will I say about it? One thing that I think is very, very different. I was talking to a photographer friend of mine, and our practices are obviously like so different. Like I think ceramics is just like agonizingly slow. Sometimes, at least I make it that way. But photography, like, so I'm just like kind of working my ass off the whole time and every stage of the process. And it takes forever. And then with photography, like you kind of like most of the work is sort of like being able to identify and like act at the perfect moment. Like there's something that you have to make sure that like your eye picks up on, and you can capture and orchestrate and like make all of the formal elements of the camera work in perfect harmony in one instant. So it's like a lot of just like floating around, and then like high pressure situation where you have to perform at kind of like the highest level, or at least that's what my friend does in his work. And so there are these sort of like really opposite energies. And so I like to bring in a lot of like different kinds of ways of working into my studio, just because I get bored very easily. So yeah, I think to give you a really long-winded response, I do think there are a lot of similarities and overlaps, but I think there's a lot of differences in the way that like those processes are carried out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hello. I know that like obviously you are the subject of a lot of at least your photography and everything, and I'm sure that you use your body as a reference point for a lot of your sculptures and stuff. But do you feel like your work is a conversation specifically about your body, or do you think is it more just like bodies in general?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I guess I don't really like to give like simple answers. Like I'm not closed off to the idea of like thinking about other bodies, but I think I'm like very single-minded and kind of like fixated on my own in a way that is like I don't know when that's going to change. Like I just do a lot of like self-observation, and I think that a lot of the work like has to do with these erotic themes, but to me that's like very interior. Like it's very like self-psychological, and like although like sex can involve other people, to me it's like I don't know, more about this like battle that's happening in my own head. So like a lot of the figures are like me me doing me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like I don't know, it might change in the future. And it's obviously like informed by experiences with other people, or like conversations with how other people experience their bodies. But yeah, I think it's very like self-focused, maybe a little bit self-indulgent in some ways too. So
I think also when you're dealing with a subject matter that's discussing like disembodiment and feeling of like disattachment to the body with that you inhabit, that is such like that's a very introspective and personal sort of experience. And I think that'd be hard to talk about, with reference to other bodies.
yeah, like to me, it's never really felt, I don't know, I have like this arbitrary system of ethics that I use with like what experiences I can express, like in what ways. And so yeah, that's like never felt really like ethically very right to me, because I just like don't have access to those kind of like gross little brain pockets. I just kind of only feel comfortable talking about mine, I guess, in that way. Because I think there's just a lot of like messiness involved with it. Like there's a lot of really complicated, tangled up feelings. And I can't pretend to have access to other people's versions of that. But I know just based on, conversations with other people, that it's like a shared experience, even though it's like specific for everybody. There's this sort of like disembodiment that happens, or this kind of like confusion about like, I don't know what, like embodiment itself is like, it's just such a complicated thing, like sometimes like so powerful and easy to access, and then sometimes it's like you're like floating away in a little brain balloon and your body's just like not even there. So I don't know, I think that's a shared experience, probably not with everybody, hopefully not. But yeah.
It's a really nice gallery and exhibit. Is this in Louisville itself, or is it how does it fit in with the art scene there? It's kind of foreign to me, I guess.
Hi, Kina. Nice plant. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe Megan and Brisbane can talk a little bit more about that, but houseguest is kind of like I would call it like an experimental like living room gallery kind of situation. It's in Louisville. Yeah, it's like what do you call it? Old Louisville, like.
So we're in a weird little middle space in between Old Louisville and South Louisville. We're like a couple of blocks from U of L. But yeah, we're an experimental artist-run non-commercial artist space that operates out of Brooklyn's home currently, but I was the original inhabitant. I started the space. We host 5 to 6 exhibitions a year. We do artist talks like this. Before the pandemic, we hosted supper clubs. My ex-partner was a chef, and we did pay what you can, conceptual dining experiences. We've done a food redistribution organization. We've done, what else have we done? Like casual in progress critiques that were open to the public. That was like a partnership that we did with the Ruckus publication out of Louisville. We hosted a senior thesis exhibition for IUS's ceramics department in 2021. So we kind of, we operate in a weird little middle space, kind of in between like academia and activism, I think.
It's cool. Well, I wish I could check it out in person, but the pictures did a pretty good job. So
yeah, thank you so much, Lalana, for contributing those.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a crazy person, and I will always take way too many photographs.
That is a good quality to have. So yeah, we're gonna keep this pretty casual. So any questions that anyone may have, you can just turn your mic on and ask, or write into the chat down below, and we can read those off.
Yeah, for sure.
So
I can also,
I'd say
Sorry.
something if there's a space to,
sure.
I'm gonna ask you a question. Hi, sweetie.
Hi.
You like my art? Yes, dear. Here.
Could use a little work.
Yeah. You take fragments of the body, let's say, and they're distorted in some ways. I mean, there's some humor in that, it seems, but it's also confrontational. I mean, it brings up, I mean, for me, like feelings about the body, that maybe, so, I mean, and you also said that sometimes you have to remind yourself that you're actually in the flesh, maybe not in a body, in a brain balloon or something. Is the art primarily self-expression, or is there a communication? This is kind of like what Brooklyn, I think, was asking, or kind of connected to that question anyway. Is it primarily self-expression, or is there a communication you'd like for the pieces to make?
That's a really good question. And I think that's something I've been, I guess I would answer that from kind of the perspective of like the process by which you make the work. And so I think that like in a lot of academic circles or art making in general, you're like kind of pressured to like say that you had all these reasons or like intentions behind making the work. And that like, I don't know, it's always like felt to me like that's like the way that you're supposed to do it is like you set out and you like make a plan and like this is the communication you're going to make and these are the choices that you're going to make that communication, and that's just like never worked for me. It never quite happens that way, and so like I'm sure there's like a lot of subtext and like psychological subconscious reasons why things come out the way that they come out, but it's a lie to say that like I intend for the work to do this thing in these ways. I think that it's been pretty liberating for me to think about art making as more of like a function, like less of like creating this perfect object that's going to do this thing, and more of just like getting the thing like out of your body, so it's like not in there anymore. And so I think that I would say it's like 100% like self-expression, and hopefully there's like these ways that I can like decide what I take in as input and like what like tools I can take on into my practice to kind of like channel that energy a little bit more. But I really try to actually like not have a set goal for how things are going to turn out, and just sort of like let the brain stuff come out. And I guess if there's any sort of like general purpose behind that, it's just to sort of like bear the humanity that's like inside, and like share a little bit of vulnerability. So it's like not a specific purpose, but it's sort of like hopefully there's like some fragments that people are like, oh, shit, like I feel that way too. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
It does. Thank you.
For sure. Thanks
Hi, Lalana.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi, it's so nice to see you.
Thank you for coming.
Inspired by your courage. And yeah, I guess what I want to say is, I was really struck when you were talking about the tongue, like the tongue is a sex organ and genderless. And there's something like, I don't know if somehow your work has got its, I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but its finger on the pulse of the zeitgeist of what's happening right now in our culture, as we hopefully are moving towards a greater sense of gender fluidity and allowance of gender fluidity and you know, stuff that in my generation that just barely existed, and now it seems like with younger human beings that have so much more like liberation around that, and so much more freedom and acceptance and intelligence, and I guess I perceive that in everything I saw in your work today, and that's very helpful to me as I struggle as like this old person to try to just really be able to fully embrace all, you know, this in a way that not just to intellectually understand it, but to be an ally. Yeah. You know, like
Yeah.
for all that, for all that is. Yeah. And in that, so it's very great to see you and see what you're doing. And if you could respond to what I just said, that would be great. Because it feels
Yeah.
like you're,
Yeah,
you know, this is
totally.
really important. Your work is very important in this regard.
Cool. Well, that's thank you for those comments. That's really great. And that was like a huge compliment that like you're feeling that in the work. I guess it's like it's really important for me. Like, I don't know, I've learned a lot. Like I've just like had my brain kind of like shattered open by like reading different kinds of like philosophical literature, like specifically Judith Butler work, which is like very, very dense. And like, I don't know, like in art school, I talk a lot about like art school and grad school, and we get pushed a lot to, I think like posture and like talk about philosophy and things like that with like a lot of syllables. But like a result of that, I think for me is that like there is a lot of truth and like brain expansion that happens with philosophical thought as well, even though it's kind of like jargon heavy and really difficult to understand. I think when you start to like tease apart like elements of culture that you kind of take for granted, you start to like have these realizations about just how kind of like patchwork and piecemeal and like artificial everything really is, and like how malleable it is too. And so like yeah, I just have I read a lot of gender theory when I can like plow through a couple pages at a time, get through a book every year, so something like that. And just like start to think about things a little bit differently, as well as I think it's more important than anything to for me at least to like have like actual conversations with like actual people who have those kinds of feelings like body dysmorphia and whatever. And like I don't really think that that's exactly what I'm talking about with the work, but I think that there is like a sort of like shared human condition of like you get this body, and like you don't really get to pick it, like you're just in that thing, and you got to kind of grapple with that for your life, and like maybe that's like a really smooth process, and maybe it's not, or maybe it's like depends on the day and the situation. And so yeah, I guess it's like it's really important, I think, to not like talk about things that you don't really experience like in art making. Like I feel like I have to have like an access, that's like one of my criteria, I have to have like a specific personal access point for the work. It hasn't always been that way, but I've like learned that like it feels better, more ethical, more potent when I like work from my own experience. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe like hopefully what is reflected there is sort of like a authenticity that I think is really important for art making, and like not speaking for other people, but like talking about things that might be relatable. So yeah, thanks for your comment. That was awesome.
Thank you.
I think, oh, sorry. Oh,
No,
wait. Okay. Hi, Luana. Beautiful work. I think that I was really interested in like the question about, or like how you talked about like content or like concept, like it doesn't have to like always mean like this grand thing. Like it could, but like it doesn't always have to. And I think that ceramics, at least like from my viewpoint, because like like I do a lot of photography, or I don't know, like 2D work. So I feel like ceramics has this way, like as you were saying, like where it is like this longer process. Like, so if I guess like what I want to ask, I'm sorry, I'm like jumping around so much, but like if the concept isn't something that like is driving like how you're making like things with your hands, like do you start with like a sketch or like photos like from the movies to like plan out like how the sculpture will go, or are you like completely like responding like in the moment of like how things are going like as you're building? So yeah, I think that's something I've always been like kind of curious about with ceramics, because it's so like, I don't know, ceramics is like so like sexy to me because I don't know much about it. So like yeah, I think I'm wondering about all of that,
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a good one. It would probably be like a good idea to work from photos or have a lot of source material in my studio. To be honest, I like keep it pretty bare bones in there. Like I do like reading, and I have like art books and stuff that I look at, and I'll like look at work and read about work and stuff like that. But I rarely ever have like a sketch or like a reference photo or anything like that that I'm like specifically trying to make. With the clay portion, that is like I always start with the ceramic portions. I build those. I usually like build them and finish them like to completion, like through multiple firings, and like get the surface tight and finished, and then like I start with everything else. So I do like I very much use like sketches and plans when I make like the furnitures and like the structures that things are sitting on. But like when I'm making the, like I guess I would call the ceramic portions like the figures, or like the little me's, and everything else is like gallery structure, like pedestal structure or something like that. Even if it's like very, very different, that's how I view it. It's like like a way to present, even if it's like part of the work. So yeah, I rarely ever start with like a sketch or an idea in mind. I usually just kind of like, it's like a struggle. Like I just struggle in this days and weeks and sometimes months. I struggle.
That
but I
is
feel
very
like
relatable.
yeah, sometimes it takes a really long time for it to come out. And I guess it's like I have started with sketches before, like I've done that. And I guess that's sort of what I was talking about a little bit before with like, I guess I was talking about that conceptually with like having like plans for how things are going to go and then executing them. And I've done that like with the ceramic portions of things before. And for me, it just like really sucks the joy out of the process. Like it's just not so fun to plan so much. Like, God damn, I'm like, I plan like every little thing of my whole life. Like I'm very type A like that, and it's absolutely exhausting. And sometimes like I just like really need to have like trust myself, trust the process. I need to like girl boss a little bit and just like let it happen. So yeah, that's what I try to do with the ceramic portions, at least. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, it's like
Yeah,
a real
totally.
struggle. There's like a lot of things I think though too that with 3D, it's such a huge challenge to translate, because it's like even if you make a sketch, like that sucker is gonna look different from every other different angle. So it's just like kind of impossible for me to like expect that or anticipate that, and I kind of have to like sketch out loud or whatever in 3 dimensions. So that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question. Thanks for coming. Thanks for all your help with the print.
Oh yeah. Great job.
Thanks.
I was just gonna ask if you could make just the stuff that you were saying about like using smaller scale and everything earlier was catching my eye. I didn't know if you could like just talk about that more, because you do make like you make a lot of larger scale stuff, but I am really drawn to like the smaller things that you do, and just I guess more of what that means for you and everything, and like your thoughts behind that.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, scale, I think that scale is something that it's like I thought about it in like this really simplistic way for so many years. It's like it's either like little or it's big or it's like 1-to-1. And I actually, there's this book, I don't know if like anybody has like the fortitude to read this book. It's a pretty good one. It's called On Longing by Susan Stewart. And it's sort of like all about scale, but it's also about like I don't know, like the philosophical approach to like the miniature and the sublime, like the sublime being like so gigantic that we're like absolutely swallowed up by it, and like what those different experiences feel like. It's like very descriptive, and also there's like portions about like the collection, like how the collection functions. There's portions on like nostalgia and collecting, and like souvenirs and like what purpose souvenirs hold, like how an object can like mean more, or like differently, like stand for like these massive ideas, even though it's like this very, very small embodied thing. And so I don't know, I think that like especially as like people who make stuff, like I make a lot of stuff sort of like cathartically, or like I don't know, I don't it's kind of just like has to happen. And I know that like a lot of us feel that way, who make various works. And so I don't know, like I think that we in some ways like we recognize that objects have like a lot of power, and then like obviously in other ways like you're gonna like die, and like you can't like take that with you like when you're dead. But like while you're alive, like all these objects that you have in your home or that you interact with are like they all do things, like they all sort of like fill up like textural space around us. And so yeah, I don't know, it's like I'm gonna be like thinking about it till I die for sure. And like so I think a lot of what I make, especially the stuff that I made for houseguest, is kind of like really small scale or like half scale, quarter scale kinds of things, which functions different from like a real miniature. Like I guess like one thing that I think about that is kind of like discussed in On Longing a little bit is sort of like the dollhouse and the miniature, and how like looking down on like a like if you place that in contrast with the sublime, which is this thing that you can't like fully ever encapsulate because it's sort of like surrounding you and swallowing you up. Like the miniature is something that like maybe like the implication is that like you have the power to do that to it, or that like you get like this like omniscient godlike power over the thing, where it's just like a little chess piece or a little thing that you can move around. And so yeah, I don't know, I think it's, for me, it's like always the challenge is always like to find the words, but like I don't know, like the feeling that you get when you see a miniature, at least for me, is like very universal. It's like squealing and I think there's like a specific kind of power play that's happening there. Like I don't know, it's like this little thing, like a little thing that you could kind of like get access to it in ways that you might not access a bigger thing. And then as we approach like, I don't know, like one-to-one body scale, whatever that means, it gets a little bit more, maybe a little bit more simplistic of a relationship. Like it's sort of like a relating everything to your body scale kind of relationship. I don't know, I have like a whole ton of feelings about scale, but there's this one little fact that I learned that is kind of unsettling and maybe relates to like photography and the image, which is that like I don't know, like we think that we like our perception is so flawed. Like when you look in the mirror, there's this like mathematical way that they like measure how big your reflection is. And so like when you look in the mirror, it's like, oh, I'm that big. But what's actually happening, like if you measure your head or whatever, no matter where you're standing, the image that you're seeing is half as big as you are. And I don't think that changes like as you get closer. I don't know, I could be mistaken. There's just some like really strange mathematical relationship where like your brain turns that thing into like a normal one-to-one scale, but that's not what's happening. And just, I don't know, on like a more, I need to like stop rambling about perception, but just on like a more basic level too, like the way that your eye and like the camera functions, like everything that comes in, like because of the way the apertures work, everything that comes in is literally upside down, because like everything outside comes in and it's flipped, and then your brain just like convinces you that it's upright all the time. So it's like that's not how it is, but that's how it feels. And so I don't know if that has any relevance to like scale decisions or whatever, but your brain is very good at tricking you, and I think that that's really interesting. Okay, well.
So I would actually like to hear more about your thoughts about like the relationship between our perception of our body in the mirror and how a camera interacts with documenting bodies. I think that's fascinating. I had a couple of other questions though, if you don't want to keep talking about that.
Oh, you don't want to get me started.
I was really, so for me personally, I have interest in kind of like the archetypal language around different types of fabrics, both synthetic and organic. And when I was looking at your images before the talk tonight, I was really interested in hearing about the relationship between the types of textiles that you had chosen to include in the installation of the exhibition. So for example, like you referenced that faux fur, and it looks like a quilted cotton, but I could be incorrect. And you talk about like artificiality, but I guess let me pull up my question here. I guess my real question is like, is there any symbolic weight to the semiotics of the textiles that you chose, like for example, like that quilted cotton that might not be cotton, and sort of like domestic interiors.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for me to get like more involved in the like specificity of the fabric. To be totally candid with you, I go to Joanne Fabrics and I like rub those bad boys and see what looks good. I think it depends on the purpose of the thing. Like for the upholstered pieces, a lot of what I do, I spend a lot of time color matching with the ceramic objects. And so like it's kind of important for me to like create not necessarily seamless, but like a really tight relationship between the palettes of the figures and the palettes of the fabrics.
Mhm.
And they need to be like comfortable when it's like an upholstered piece like that. Like I want it to feel good, because I want them to be comfortable. So I think, I don't know, like one thing that like color relationship I think can do is sort of like blend the figure a little bit into the furniture, which I think is funny to me. And there's, I don't know, like these relationships to domestic interiors and like women in domestic interiors, like the yellow wallpaper and things like I don't know, like relationships to like psychosis that I don't know, like come with this sort of like blending of like furniture and interiors with the body. And so sometimes I do that with color a little bit. And then like with I called it like a pelt, like the faux fur pelt kind of situation. I also like have earlier works that like the frame was upholstered with this sort of like very kitschy, cheap synthetic faux fur. And so I think with those pieces, like I really like to lean into the cheapness of the work, like especially when I'm thinking about like relationships to fine art materials, which are like elevated because they're expensive. Like I like to take things that are just like absolutely garbage and put them in a gallery because that's funny to me. It's also like a challenge, so I don't know. I think the faux fur is like really obviously super fake and kitschy, but it also has this relationship to like prop and performance culture. And so I think that's how I like the pieces to function. It's like they're playing like dress up and they're like doing their silly little roles, like with their silly little nipples or whatever it is. And it's like fake, like it's all fake. Or like it's like an imitation of a thing. And so that's like the material is another way to like signify that like it's not real fur, but it's like trying so hard. And I don't know, I think that's very funny. And I guess like one last thing about fabrics or materials, I guess this isn't fabric so much, but I spent a lot of time last year like learning how to like heat sew garbage bags. So I think that's like another way that it's like similar to faux fur, that it's like this like absolutely garbage material. Like I would take like literal trash bags and with like an iron or whatever, like they melt and like turn into like lace kind of. And so I was making like curtain sets with trash bags. And they have these like very lovely differences in opacity because they're just so shitty. They're just like not consistent throughout. And so yeah, I think that's pretty important to me to kind of like elevate the trash material or make it act as a fine art material, and kind of like sneak under the radar into the gallery in that way. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, unless there are any further questions, we can go ahead and wrap up for the evening, Lalana, if you're cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm good. I really appreciate all your questions. Those were very thoughtful and yeah, poignant. I really appreciate participation, and thanks for tuning in, especially if you didn't get to see it. It's been cool to be able to show it this way. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who joined us this evening and gave us some of your time. It's much appreciated as always.
Great to see you, Lalana, and Megan. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
And thank you to Brooklyn for helping with the installation of this wonderful show.
Thank you both for everything.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thanks everybody. I really appreciate it.
All right, wonderful. Well, we'll go ahead and call this a night then. Everyone have a lovely evening and be safe and enjoy the holiday weekend. Awesome.
Good night.
Thank you all. Have a good
All
night.
right, night, guys.